My name is Nathan, and I've always believed in the simple things in life. Loyalty, respect, trust. These were the foundations upon which I'd built my existence. A calm, methodical person by nature, I never acted impulsively. Every decision, every move I made was calculated. It was easy to navigate the world this way. Control was everything. I was used to being the one who held things together, even when others couldn't see the strain I was under. I'd met Clara 3 years ago. She was different from anyone I had ever known. Free-spirited, confident, and above all, kind. The type of person who never let go of her principles, no matter how messy the world became. We fell in love in the way that felt almost too perfect to be real. The kind of love you read about in novels, where the world around you fades away, and all that remains is the person who holds your heart. Our marriage was a quiet, happy affair, until she introduced me to her mother, Helen. Helen, with her steely gaze and sharp tongue, seemed harmless at first. I figured, after all, a mother's love was protective, if not a little overwhelming. But the first time I truly felt the weight of her presence was when she'd subtly critiqued our living arrangements, making me feel like the way I lived wasn't good enough for her daughter. Still, I brushed it off. She was family, and Clara's happiness meant everything to me. It started innocently enough. Helen would drop by uninvited, criticize our home, suggest ways we could improve our lives. It wasn't just small talk. It was pointed, as if she were planting seeds, trying to make me feel inadequate, as if I wasn't good enough for her daughter. Clara would always brush it off, saying her mother was just being motherly. But I saw through the facade. I was too cautious not to notice the power plays, the manipulations. Then the financial troubles began. I had been working in finance for years, and everything had been fine. But one day I found myself facing unexpected losses due to a bad investment. One that had seemed solid at the time, but had unraveled in the most public way possible. I had always been the rock, the steady hand that made decisions with care. To have something crumble in front of me was humbling, almost humiliating. As the weeks passed, the pressure mounted. The stakes grew higher, and I couldn't escape the constant reminder that I had failed. At least in the eyes of my in-laws, who now looked at me with barely veiled disdain. Helen was quick to seize on my misfortune. Her words, veiled in concern, were always pointed, designed to make me question my ability, my decisions. But I never confronted her, until the day she made it impossible for me to stay silent. It was a quiet afternoon, and Clara and I were sitting in the living room, discussing the mounting bills, the overwhelming pressure. As I turned to her to offer comfort, the phone rang. I didn't think much of it at first, but when Clara got up to answer, I overheard snippets of the conversation. Helen was on the other end. "We need to talk, Clara. Nathan isn't the man I thought he was. He's failing you, and you deserve more than this. I don't know what you see in him, but he's nothing but a disappointment." The words felt like a punch in the gut. The room, which had been filled with the hum of our conversation, suddenly grew cold. I froze, staring at the floor as Clara's voice softened, trying to calm her mother. "No, Mom. I'm not. He's just going through a rough patch. We're figuring it out." But I knew, deep down, that Clara's loyalty was wavering. In that moment, I realized something I'd been blind to before. Helen wasn't just a critical mother. She was a manipulator, a puppet master pulling strings from the shadows. And Clara, my loving wife, was her pawn. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was deeper, more insidious. Helen had played on my vulnerabilities, weaponizing my shortcomings to drive a wedge between Clara and me. She didn't want to just break our marriage. She wanted to shatter my self-worth, reduce me to a failure in my own eyes. I could feel the tension in Clara's voice as she tried to convince her mother of my worth. but the damage was done. That night, Clara didn't speak much. She sat beside me, but her eyes were distant, clouded with doubt. I could sense the shift, even if she didn't say the words. The silence between us grew heavier by the second. As I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt something inside me break. The calm control I'd once prided myself on had shattered. I wasn't the steady, confident man I used to be. In my mind, I could hear Helen's voice echoing, repeating her accusations like a mantra. "He's failing you. He's not good enough." I didn't know how it had happened, but in that moment, I realized that my marriage, my entire life, had been hijacked. What hurt most wasn't the financial ruin, wasn't even the words spoken by Helen. It was the realization that Clara, the woman I loved with all my heart, was beginning to believe them. I was no longer just a man in a marriage struggling with financial stress. I was a man betrayed, not just by Helen, but by the woman who had promised to stand by me. I could feel the pressure building inside me, the anger bubbling up like a storm. But beneath the anger, something colder, more methodical, began to take shape. I had been betrayed in the most intimate way possible. The woman I trusted, the woman who was supposed to love me, was now questioning my worth because of her mother's relentless campaign. I realized I had two choices: to let this break me, to retreat into the shadows of self-pity, or to take control, to reclaim my power. And so, the plan began to form, not with rage but with cold precision. I would make them both regret ever underestimating me. The first step wasn't anger, it was patience. I would make Helen's manipulations work against her. I would rebuild myself, but not just for me, for them. They would see me for who I truly was, and they would regret ever doubting me. But for now, I would wait. I would bide my time, gathering the pieces I needed, preparing for the moment when I would strike. It wasn't a matter of vengeance anymore. It was about restoring what had been taken from me, the control, the respect, the dignity. The calm, controlled man that I had been was no more. Now I would be something else. The days that followed the phone call were like a slow-burning fuse, each moment ticking away until it would ignite. My mind was a cauldron of thoughts, all swirling, churning, and coming together into a single, undeniable conclusion. I needed to take control. I needed to show them who I really was. Clara's growing distance was evident. She didn't come to me with her troubles anymore. Instead, she spent more time with her mother, and the distance between us was palpable. But I couldn't confront her yet. Not now. If I wanted to regain my position in her life, I had to be strategic. I had to show her that I wasn't just the man she married out of love. I was someone worth believing in, someone worth fighting for. Helen, on the other hand, was an entirely different problem. Her machinations weren't so easily dismissed. She had control, influence, and a sharp tongue that cut to the quick. But, more importantly, she had a weakness, a chink in her armor. And it wasn't just any weakness. It was something that, once exposed, would make her crumble. That's where I would begin. The first step was not about confronting Helen directly, it was about observation. I spent the first few weeks simply watching her, learning her patterns, her routines, understanding her motivations. I watched how she manipulated Clara into second-guessing me, how she twisted her words to cast doubt on my decisions. It was an art form, the way she worked behind the scenes, pulling Clara's strings with subtlety and precision. But beneath her poised exterior, I knew there was something vulnerable. She was afraid of losing control. And I knew that fear was a weakness I could exploit. Helen had always prided herself on her business acumen. A woman of wealth, of influence, of status. She had an empire built on connections, her reputation as a shrewd negotiator preceding her. What she didn't know was that I had been quietly studying her business dealings. I wasn't just a man who made decisions with logic and precision. I was a man who had learned how to read people, to understand their strengths and weaknesses. Helen's company was not immune to scandal. There were whispers, rumors of unethical business practices, of deals made under the table. I knew that if I dug deep enough, I would find something that could unravel her carefully curated image. But I had to be patient. I couldn't move too quickly. A misstep would ruin everything. I started with small actions. I reached out to people in her business circle, quietly gathering information. I had contacts in places she would never suspect, people who owed me favors from my past work. They were subtle, quiet, and most importantly, they were loyal to me. Each piece of information I gathered was added to my mental ledger, a list of her vulnerabilities, her misdeeds, her secrets. But there was more I needed. I needed to understand Helen's relationship with Clara. I needed to know how deeply she had infiltrated our marriage. So I began to play the long game. I subtly manipulated the conversations, pushing Clara to spend more time with me, more time focusing on us. I would remind her of the times when we were close, when nothing and no one could come between us. Slowly but surely, I began to chip away at her mother's influence. But all the while I was careful, meticulous. Every move, every word, every interaction was calculated. I didn't want to appear like I was pushing Clara away from her mother. Instead, I made it seem like I was simply showing her what she had been missing. Her husband, the man who had once been her rock, who had once been her protector. Clara was beginning to see the man I had always been, the man I had allowed myself to become. She was beginning to remember why she had fallen in love with me in the first place. And that was my leverage. In the meantime, I continued to dig into Helen's business dealings. I followed the trail of corruption, tracing her financial transactions, her shady partnerships, and her underhanded tactics. It was a slow process, each discovery more damning than the last. But I was patient. I knew that all it would take was one well-placed piece of evidence to bring her empire crashing down. And then it happened. I found the smoking gun. A contract, signed years ago, buried in the deepest recesses of her records, revealed a deal with a competitor. A deal that had been illegal, one that would land her in a world of legal trouble. It wasn't just a simple breach of ethics. It was a violation of federal law, something that could not be ignored. I had it, the one thing that could destroy her and everything she had built. But there was a catch. This contract, this key piece of evidence, wasn't something that could be presented casually. It would need to be delivered at the perfect moment, when the stakes were high, when the spotlight was on her. I couldn't simply expose it without causing a chain reaction. I needed to be sure that Helen's reputation would collapse before she could retaliate, before she could deflect the blame. I began to put the finishing touches on my plan. I arranged a meeting with some influential people in her business circle, people who trusted me, people who could help me expose her. I needed them to see her for who she truly was, to understand that she had been manipulating everyone around her, including her own daughter. The stage was set, but I still needed one more thing: Clara's trust. If I could show Clara that her mother was not the woman she thought she was, that she had been manipulated and used all along, perhaps I could finally sever the last thread that bound her to Helen. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about restoring balance, about showing Clara that I was the man who had always been by her side, the man who would never betray her. The pieces were falling into place, each step taking me closer to my goal. But the more I prepared, the more I realized that this wasn't just about taking down Helen. It was about proving something to myself. I had been made to feel inadequate, unworthy. But now, I was on the verge of proving that I was not just a man to be underestimated. I was a man who could rebuild, who could rise from the ashes and reclaim what was rightfully mine. And as I sat in my office, reviewing the final details of my plan, I couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. The moment of reckoning was coming. And Helen, for all her cunning and manipulation, had no idea what was about to hit her. The night before everything would unfold, I could hardly sleep. My mind buzzed with the excitement of the plan finally coming to fruition, each element in place, each move carefully orchestrated. It wasn't the excitement of raw vengeance, not the kind of rage that makes a man reckless. No, it was the satisfaction of knowing I had maneuvered all the pieces exactly where I needed them to be. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Everything else had been leading to this point. I had spent weeks building a false sense of security for Helen, allowing her to believe that she had won, that her manipulation had succeeded in driving a wedge between Clara and me. She thought she had me cornered, thought that her whispers and subtle moves had left me broken. But nothing could be further from the truth. I wasn't broken, I was simply waiting for the right moment to strike. I had made sure to plant the seeds of doubt in Clara's mind over the last few weeks, but I was careful, never pushing too hard. I didn't want to seem like I was trying to control her. Instead, I made sure that every time Helen came into our conversations, Clara would start to see the cracks. She would start to realize that perhaps her mother's love wasn't as unconditional as she had thought. That night, I arranged a dinner, a quiet affair, just the three of us, Clara, Helen, and me. Helen had no idea that I had invited a few select guests to join us. These weren't just any guests. They were key figures in Helen's professional life, people who, unbeknownst to her, had been waiting for the right moment to expose her. When Helen arrived at the restaurant, her usual sharp confidence was evident. She greeted us both with that icy smile, her eyes gleaming as if she were the one in control. Clara seemed distant, her usual warmth dimmed by the invisible barrier that had grown between us. But tonight, that barrier would finally come down. As we sat down at the table, I let the conversation flow casually at first. Helen spoke about her latest business endeavors. As usual, dropping names of important clients and making subtle jabs about my financial struggles. But I didn't flinch. I just let her speak, knowing full well what was coming. The dinner was a carefully orchestrated dance, each word spoken with purpose, each move designed to slowly tighten the noose around Helen's neck. I wasn't going to be the one to expose her, not directly, at least. I had set up everything perfectly so that she would expose herself. At just the right moment, I let slip a seemingly innocent comment about one of her deals, one I knew would spark a reaction. I watched as her eyes widened, the smallest hint of panic flickering across her face before she masked it with that familiar icy calm. I could see the tension building in her body as I mentioned a particular contract, one that was damning in its implications. Funny, I read something recently about a deal with a competitor, I said, leaning back in my chair, my eyes fixed on her. The one you made with Adler Industries, wasn't it? Her smile faltered for a second, just a flicker, but it was enough for me to see. She'd been cornered, and she knew it. But she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a long sip of her wine, trying to regain control. Clara, sensing the shift in the conversation, looked between us. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. It was time. I leaned in, my voice low but firm. "I've been doing some digging, Clara. I know about the contract. The one Helen made with Adler Industries. It's illegal. The kind of deal that could destroy everything she's worked for. You deserve to know the truth." Helen's eyes flared with panic, but she quickly regained her composure. "Nathan, that's absurd. You're making something out of nothing." But the damage was done. The seed had been planted, and Clara could no longer ignore it. She turned to her mother, her face pale. "What is he talking about, Mom? What is this deal?" I could see the horror in Helen's eyes. The walls she had so carefully built around her began to crumble. She tried to deflect, tried to spin the conversation in a way that made her look like the victim. But Clara wasn't listening anymore. Her eyes were locked on her mother, and I could see the cracks in their relationship widen. The truth, no matter how carefully hidden, was finally coming to the surface. At that moment, I signaled for my guests to enter. They weren't just anyone. They were influential people who had once been her allies, now disillusioned by her lies. They stepped into the room quietly, their presence heavy with purpose. They knew what was at stake. They were here to watch Helen's empire unravel. Helen's composure faltered completely as she recognized the faces in the room. "What are they doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. But it was no longer the voice of the powerful woman who had always controlled every conversation. Now it was the voice of a woman trapped in her own lies. "They're here to hear the truth, Helen," I said quietly. "The truth that's been hidden for far too long." I watched as Helen's face drained of color, the shock and panic seeping into her expression. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but the weight of the evidence, the very people she had betrayed, was too much. They all knew now. The truth was out. I turned to Clara. Her face was unreadable, but I saw the tiny tremor in her hand as she reached out to touch mine. I could see the turmoil in her eyes as the realization set in. "Is it true?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my voice steady. "It's all true. Your mother used both of us. She didn't care about our marriage, Clara. She only cared about keeping you under her control." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen sat there, surrounded by people who once admired her, who now saw her for what she truly was. It wasn't just the business deal that had crumbled. It was her entire life, her carefully constructed image of perfection, falling apart piece by piece. And yet, even in that moment, as I watched her world collapse, I couldn't feel the rush of victory I thought I would. There was no overwhelming sense of satisfaction, no triumph in her defeat. There was only a strange emptiness. This wasn't about winning, it was about balance, about justice. But the cost of it all was greater than I had expected. I looked at Clara again, her face pale, her eyes searching mine for answers. In that moment, I realized something that I had ignored for so long. I had been focused on getting back what I had lost. My pride, my dignity, my control. But what about Clara? What about the woman who had once trusted me completely? What had all of this cost her? The last thread that had bound Clara to her mother had been severed. But what now? What was left for us after all the dust had settled? As the room filled with murmurs of shock and disbelief, I knew this was only the beginning. Helen's downfall had begun, but my own path was just as uncertain. The days following the dinner were a blur. The air felt different, as if the world had shifted on its axis. The events of that night, Helen's exposure, the unraveling of her empire, and the look on Clara's face, had left me in a state of numbness. The victory I had anticipated so eagerly felt hollow, the silence between Clara and me thick with unsaid words. Helen's response was swift. She tried to fight back, of course. She hired lawyers, attempted to silence the whispers with the same cold, calculated force she had always used. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The people who had once supported her now turned their backs. The evidence was irrefutable, the lies too many to cover up. But I didn't relish in her downfall, not the way I thought I would. I wasn't celebrating. I was waiting for Clara to process everything, to come to terms with the truth that had been forced into her life like a cruel twist of fate. Clara became distant, almost unreachable. It wasn't the distance that had been growing between us before. It was a deeper, more suffocating void. She withdrew into herself, her eyes clouded with confusion, pain, and something I couldn't quite name. There was no anger toward me, no accusation, but I could feel the questions in the air. I could feel the weight of the betrayal pressing down on her, her mind racing as she tried to reconcile the woman who had raised her with the one who had manipulated her life. I tried to reach out, but each attempt seemed futile. She was there physically, but emotionally, she had retreated into a place I couldn't follow. She needed time, I knew that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. The foundation of our relationship had been cracked, and I didn't know if I could repair it. The worst part was that I couldn't even tell her that it would be okay. I couldn't offer false reassurances because I didn't know if it would ever be okay. The truth was, I had just as many questions as she did. What had we really been fighting for all this time? Was our marriage built on love, or was it a facade? Had I been just as complicit in allowing Helen to control us both as she had been in manipulating Clara? I had made my move with calculated precision, but the aftermath was messier than I ever imagined. The peace I had so desperately sought seemed further out of reach than ever before. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in our home continued to grow. I tried to be patient, giving Clara the space she needed, but it was impossible to ignore the constant ache in my chest. She wasn't angry at me, no, it wasn't that simple. There was a sadness, a quiet resignation in her eyes that spoke volumes. And then the first confrontation came. It wasn't loud or explosive, but the weight of it crushed me just the same. I had come home after a long day at work, expecting another quiet night. But Clara was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The air in the room was thick, as if something was about to break. "Nathan," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "Why didn't you tell me?" I froze, unsure of what she meant. "Tell you what?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me about the contract? About everything? Why didn't you come to me first?" Her words stung, but it wasn't the accusation that hurt. It was the realization that I had let it go this far without her. I had made my plan, I had executed it without her, and in doing so, I had excluded her from the most important part of my life. I had thought that I could protect her by keeping her in the dark, but now I saw the truth. I had betrayed her, too. "I didn't want to drag you into it," I said quietly, my voice almost a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was wrong." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You should have trusted me, Nathan. You should have told me the truth. You didn't just take down my mother, you took down everything I believed in. I thought you were the man I married, but now I don't know who you are anymore." The words cut through me like a knife, deeper than anything Helen had ever said to me. Clara wasn't angry, no. She was devastated. She was mourning not just her mother's betrayal, but mine as well. The wall I had built around myself, the cool detachment, had failed me. In trying to protect her, I had isolated her, and now I had lost her, too. "I'm sorry, Clara," I said, my voice trembling for the first time. "I was wrong. I should have trusted you. I didn't mean to hurt you." She shook her head, her face crumpling in grief. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, Nathan. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." And that was it. The realization hit me harder than anything else. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about loss. It wasn't just about taking down Helen. It was about losing the woman I loved. And I had no idea how to fix it. The next few days were filled with silence. The house, once filled with the soft hum of our conversations, felt empty. Clara spent more time away from home, visiting friends or simply walking the streets. I tried to fill the space with work, with distractions, but nothing could fill the hole in my heart. I was no longer the calm, controlled man I had once been. I was lost, adrift in a sea of regrets and consequences that I couldn't escape. What had I really gained by destroying Helen? What had I gained by trying to rebuild my life through revenge? I didn't have the answers, not yet. But what I did know was that the woman who had once been my partner, the one I thought I could rely on, was slipping away from me. And no matter how much I had planned, no matter how much I had sacrificed, I couldn't bring her back. And so I waited. I waited for her to come to me, for the pain to fade, for the wounds to heal. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Helen was destroyed, yes, but in the process I had destroyed something far more important. Something I wasn't sure I could ever rebuild. Months have passed since that night, the night when everything fell apart. Since the day I thought I had won, I have watched as my world crumbled, piece by piece. Helen's fall from grace was swift, but the true cost of it, the collateral damage, has been slow and devastating. What I had once considered my victory now feels like a hollow triumph. A meaningless victory in a game where the rules were rewritten, and the price was too high to count. Clara is gone. She left, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in quiet resignation. She packed her things while I was at work one day, leaving behind only a note, the words heavy with pain and unanswered questions. I can't do this anymore. Not after everything. I need to find myself again. Nathan. I thought I knew who I was, but now I'm lost too. I've heard from mutual friends that she's trying to rebuild, putting her life back together, stepping out from the shadow of her mother's manipulation, stepping out from my shadow. I wonder if I had never taken that first step, if I had never exposed Helen's empire for what it was, if I had just been patient and trusted Clara, would she still be here with me? I can't answer that. I can't even look at myself in the mirror without wondering if I'm the man she once loved, or if I've become something else entirely. Time has done little to soften the blow. What I thought would be the cathartic release of exposing Helen, the final exhale after holding my breath for so long, has turned into a constant ache. Every day feels like an unending loop of regret, a world where I replay my decisions, trying to find a moment where I could have chosen differently. Helen? She's still fighting, still denying what has been exposed. Her empire crumbled, but it hasn't gone down quietly. She has money, connections, and a stubbornness that refuses to be extinguished. But it's all different now. The world sees her for what she truly is, and the masks she once wore so flawlessly are now cracked beyond repair. And me? I'm still here. But who am I now? I used to be the man who prided himself on being calm, controlled. I used to think that by calculating every move, by playing the long game, I could avoid the pain of impulse and unpredictability. But all it did was leave me in a place where I have no answers. The things I used to control, my life, my marriage, my image, are all gone, shattered in the wake of my decisions. I look at the files on my desk, the evidence of Helen's shady dealings, the financial documents that prove everything I said was true. They no longer hold any meaning for me. What use is it to have exposed someone when, in the process, you've lost everything that mattered? The quiet is the hardest part. The silence after the storm, the empty spaces that used to be filled with Clara's laughter, her presence, now nothing but echoes in a house that once felt like home. I still catch myself waiting for her to walk through the door, for her to call out to me from the other room, for the small, comforting noise of her being near. But that's gone now, and it's something I can never get back. As for Helen, I don't know if I can truly say I regret taking her down. The woman was toxic, manipulative, everything I had suspected her to be. And yet, I wonder, in my pursuit of justice, in my need to prove my worth, did I lose the very thing that made me human? Was my desire for revenge, for balance, Worth it if it cost me my soul? I know the world is quick to label this story as one of vengeance, one of a man who set things right after being wronged. People will say I had it coming. People will say that I made a choice and I got what I deserved. But that's the thing about revenge. It's a lonely road. Promises catharsis, but it delivers only emptiness. What I've come to realize is that revenge isn't sweet. It doesn't heal wounds, it only exposes them. It doesn't restore balance. It creates more imbalance. And it doesn't rebuild what was lost. It destroys everything in its wake, including the person who sets it in motion. And now, here I am, a man who once prided himself on being in control, but who is now left to pick up the pieces of a life I thought I was carefully building. I can't undo the damage I've done. I can't rewind time and make different choices. But maybe, just maybe, I can learn from this. Maybe I can rebuild, not what I had before, but something new. Something better. But first, I have to forgive myself. In the end, what did I truly gain from this? The truth? Yes. But truth without love, without understanding, is a weapon. And I used it without thinking of the consequences. I don't know what will happen to Helen. I don't know if she'll ever find redemption. I don't know if Clara will ever forgive me. But I do know this. I will never again be the man I once was. I crossed a line and I can't go back. The price of revenge is more than you can ever anticipate, and what it costs you is often far greater than what you stand to gain. So, I sit here now reflecting on everything. What was the point? What was the cost? And in the quiet, the only thing I can say is this. Revenge is a dark and lonely road, and no one, not even the one seeking justice, walks away unscathed. Thanks for watching.